And so can you sort of just briefly summarise the conclusions of your study? I mean, I understand that it's an ongoing study, but if you can just sort of summarise briefly your conclusions up to now.
Well, the most obvious initial conclusion is a heavy bias against the government in Venezuela.
Right.
We found that a tiny minority of the articles we looked at, for instance, made any positive mention at all of the Bolivarian missions, which we would have thought would be newsworthy, unusual, progressive, just the sort of thing that if it happened elsewhere would be picked up by journalists. But there was a very heavy negative weighting towards the government and the president in particular. We found that there was often an attempt to portray Hugo Chavez as someone from outside Venezuela who kind of imposes himself on it against the will of Venezuelans.
Right,
And then at the same time, a construction of the so-called opposition, of course there's no unified opposition in Venezuela, but they call it the opposition, was portrayed as kind of the legitimate democratic movement in Venezuela. So we found, right now, our initial findings are bias, the construction of Chavez as an outsider who lacks legitimacy, and the opposition, so-called, as the real inheritors of the democratic tradition.
The presentation that he lacks legitimacy despite more legitimate
Absolutely,
elections.
Absolutely. I mean, very often they won't refer to him as elected. They'll say he rose to power.
Right,
for
okay,
example.
so it's the language that's very emotive language.
Exactly, We found, again, that there's, so for example, in reporting the coup, in that instance, very, very unprofessional journalism, especially for the BBC, whose guidelines on impartiality and balance are very strong. It was quite incredible that the only sources used in the initial stages were Hugo Chavez's daughter, government ministers, and Cuba. Which is extraordinary, given that he had won elections and referenda to that point. You would have thought maybe one person who had voted for him
would have been able to come up,
would have been contacted.
Yeah.
It's not a question of them approaching the journalist, it's a question of the journalist trying to find them.
Doing the proper research.
But in fact the main voices and the main vox pops were from opponents of Chavez, which is extraordinary, because it was a coup against a democratically elected leader.